There is a monument standing on the Giza Plateau that continues to defy easy explanation, no matter how many times scholars have tried to close the file on it. Stretching more than 230 meters along each side, and once rising close to 147 meters into the desert sky, the Great Pyramid held the record as the tallest structure built by human hands for nearly 4,000 years. Millions of visitors have walked its base, thousands of papers have been written about its construction, and yet in 2024 a new kind of investigator was brought in to look at it with fresh eyes. Grok, the artificial intelligence developed by Grok AI, was fed an enormous archive of surveying data, engineering tolerances, astronomical readings, and geological reports collected over more than a century of study, then given one directive: set aside inherited assumptions and report only what the numbers themselves suggest. What came back was not a simple confirmation of the textbook narrative. It was a slow, methodical unraveling of it. Before diving into what the system found, it is worth being fair to the story most of us grew up with, because it is not a foolish one. The standard account holds that around 2560 BCE, during Egypt's 4th dynasty, the pharaoh Khufu commissioned a tomb worthy of his reign. Skilled crews, not chained slaves as old films like to suggest, quarried limestone on site, floated granite down the Nile from distant quarries, and hauled the blocks into position using sledges, ropes, and ramps over roughly 2 decades. This picture rests on real physical evidence. Archaeologists have excavated worker villages nearby complete with bakeries and breweries, found administrative papyri describing shipments of stone, and uncovered painted markings from work gangs proudly calling themselves things like the Friends of Khufu. None of that evidence is in dispute. The organization of labor, the logistics of feeding and housing a large workforce, the pride the builders took in their work, all of it holds up under scrutiny. Where the official account grows shakier is not in explaining who moved the stone, but in explaining how the stone was shaped, leveled, and aligned to a standard that still challenges modern instruments. That is the seam Grok was pointed toward, and it is worth understanding why that seam matters so much. Organizing tens of thousands of laborers is a logistics problem, and logistics problems can be solved with enough time, food, and discipline. Precision is a different animal entirely. You cannot motivate your way into a fraction of a millimeter. You cannot inspire a crew into achieving an accuracy your tools were never designed to reach. Precision reflects knowledge, not effort, and it was in the realm of precision that the numbers began behaving strangely. The first place Grok's analysis stopped was the foundation itself, the least glamorous measurement imaginable. Is the base level? Across a footprint larger than several football fields laid end to end, survey data puts the entire platform level to within about 2 centimeters. Picture a slab of glass the size of a city block, where the highest and lowest points differ by less than the width of 2 fingers, except this glass wasn't poured in one piece. It was assembled from over 2 million individual blocks, each fitted and adjusted by hand, using nothing more sophisticated than a wooden square, a plumb line, and a trough of water to check for level. When Grok was asked to estimate the likelihood of achieving that degree of flatness using only those tools across that distance, and holding it consistent on every side, the result it returned was not framed as impossible, but as deeply improbable, the kind of outcome that would fail far more often than it succeeds once you factor in tired workers, shifting sand, and water that behaves differently as the desert heats it. For context, modern construction doesn't even attempt this level of precision. Engineers pouring a skyscraper's foundation today accept tolerances many times looser than what exists at Giza, because buildings simply don't need to be that flat to function. By any practical measure, the pyramid's foundation is roughly 10 times more precise than its purpose as a tomb would ever require. From there, the analysis turned to orientation, and the picture didn't get more comfortable. The pyramid's 4 faces don't just roughly face the cardinal directions, they are aligned to true north, true south, true east, and true west with a deviation of only a few arc minutes, a fraction of a single degree spread across the entire horizon. True north isn't something a simple compass can find, since a compass follows the wandering magnetic pole rather than the fixed axis the planet spins on. Locating true north requires watching the night sky, identifying the still point around which the stars appear to rotate, and then transferring that invisible celestial reference down into a straight line on the ground, holding that line true across 230 meters of construction. Grok flagged this as the kind of accuracy typically associated with modern surveying equipment, not with an early Bronze Age society working from naked eye observation. And once again, the model asked a simple but pointed question. Why would a tomb need this? A burial chamber gains nothing practical from facing true north with such exactness. No ceremony depends on it. No visitor could ever perceive the difference between 3 arc minutes and dead-on perfection. When accuracy this extreme serves no discernible function, the excess itself becomes the detail worth investigating, since precision without purpose usually means the precision was the purpose. The next thread the system pulled on involved simple geometry, the kind you could sketch with a stick in the sand, yet it has puzzled mathematicians for 2 centuries. Divide the pyramid's full base perimeter by its original height, before the outer casing stones and capstone were stripped away over the centuries, and the result lands remarkably close to 2 times pi, the ratio describing a circle's circumference relative to its radius. Conventional Egyptology has a tidy explanation for this. Ancient surveyors likely measured horizontal ground distance by counting the rotations of a wheel or drum, and measured vertical height using stacked cubit units. Roll a wheel to measure the earth and count sticks to measure the sky, and pi can slip into your numbers without anyone intending it or even naming the concept. That explanation is elegant, and for a single measurement, it's plausible. But Grok wasn't looking at a single measurement. It found the same ratio surfacing again at other, unrelated points across the pyramid's geometry, in places where a simple measuring wheel couldn't plausibly account for the pattern. When you run the odds on the same signature appearing repeatedly across independent variables, coincidence starts to look like a strained explanation, and intention becomes the more economical one. Then there was a second number, older in feel but far younger on paper. Phi? The golden ratio, roughly 1.618, the proportion found in nautilus shells, sunflower seed spirals, and tree branching patterns, prized by artists and architects for the way it pleases the human eye without anyone fully understanding why. As far as the written historical record shows, phi wasn't formally described until Greek geometers set it down on parchment, more than 2,000 years after the last stone was placed atop this structure. Grok's analysis identified the ratio embedded in at least 7 separate places within the pyramid's proportions, in the relationship between height and base, in the incline of the faces, in internal chamber measurements. Unlike pi, phi can't slip into your numbers by accident through a rolling wheel. It has to be understood and deliberately calculated. Finding it once might be forgivable as coincidence. Finding it 7 times, spread through independent dimensions of the same structure, reads less like an accident and more like a signature, evidence of a mathematical sophistication the conventional timeline doesn't have room for. The most striking correlation came when the system compared the pyramid's dimensions directly against the size of the planet it sits on. Multiplying the original height by 43,200 produces a figure strikingly close to Earth's polar radius. Multiplying the base perimeter by that same number produces a figure close to Earth's equatorial circumference. 2 different structural measurements, the same multiplier, and 2 different planetary dimensions, as if the entire monument functioned as a scale model of the world at a ratio of 1 to 43,200. That number itself isn't arbitrary. It corresponds to the number of seconds in 12 hours, tying the proportion back to the planet's rotation. Grok framed the implication plainly. Whoever encoded this relationship would have needed to know both the polar and equatorial measurements of Earth, 2 figures that differ specifically because the planet bulges slightly at the equator, a subtlety we didn't confirm with certainty until the era of satellites. Attributing that knowledge to a civilization working with copper chisels and wooden sledges is, at minimum, a stretch the current historical model doesn't easily accommodate. What makes all of this harder to dismiss as isolated oddities is that Grok wasn't treating each finding in a vacuum. It weighed the leveling precision, the astronomical alignment, the recurrence of pi, the 7-fold appearance of phi, and the planetary-scale relationship together, as a single body of evidence rather than a scattered list of curiosities. Individually, each one can be argued away with a generous enough explanation. Together, they start to form a pattern that resists easy dismissal. And to its credit, the system didn't leap toward wild conclusions. It didn't declare that extraterrestrials built the pyramid, and it didn't insist on a lost continent swallowed by the sea. What it did was quieter and, in some ways, more unsettling. It examined the conventional narrative of pharaohs, copper tools, and 20 years of labor, and adjudged that narrative insufficient to fully account for what the stone actually demonstrates. Not fraudulent, not invented out of nothing, simply incomplete. That leaves a handful of possibilities on the table, none of which comfortably fits inside the timeline most of us were taught in school. Perhaps the Egyptians of that era possessed a technical sophistication that later dynasties gradually lost, leaving only crumbs of evidence behind. Perhaps the knowledge wasn't originally theirs at all, but inherited from an older culture whose own history has vanished from the record. Perhaps there was once a more advanced civilization scattered by some catastrophic upheaval near the end of the last ice age, its survivors carrying fragments of astronomy and mathematics into the cultures that followed, the way refugees carry heirlooms across a border. Or perhaps, and Grok raised this only because the data didn't rule it out, the answer lies somewhere the conventional imagination hasn't wanted to go at all. None of these possibilities have been proven, and it's worth saying clearly that mainstream Egyptology has responded to claims like these before, often with reasonable counterarguments about measurement tolerances, selective use of data, and the tendency to cherry-pick ratios out of large sets of numbers where some coincidental matches are statistically expected. Skeptics point out that with enough measurements to choose from, you can often find numbers that appear to encode pi, phi, or planetary dimensions purely through chance, especially if you're flexible about which measurement of height or perimeter you use. That pushback deserves to be taken seriously rather than waved away, and it's part of why archaeologists remain cautious about drawing sweeping conclusions from these numerical alignments alone. Still, the questions Grok raised are not going away quietly, and they tap into something people have wondered about for centuries every time they've stood at the base of that structure and looked up. If you strip away what you were taught and look only at the stone itself, the leveling, the alignment, the recurring irrational ratios, the planetary proportions folded into a monument built thousands of years before anyone was supposed to understand them, which explanation feels closest to true? Forgotten Egyptian expertise erased by time? Knowledge inherited from an older, now vanished culture? A civilization lost to catastrophe whose survivors rebuilt elsewhere? Or something else entirely that we haven't fully reckoned with? The pyramid isn't offering an easy answer. It never has. But for the first time, a machine with nothing to protect and no reputation on the line has said, out loud, that the easy answer might not be the whole one.